Lecture 3. Defining Modernism. Monet's Cathedral.
The term modernism has been problematic since its coinage by the generation of artists and writers who first used it to distinguish themselves from their 19th century ancestors. The term has been immensely complicated since by academics and even by public policy specialists. The architectural historian's modernism is very different from the economic and political modernism referred to in our current discourse on globalization. So it's a bad term. It can mean too many things. It's very widely used. And it's also a bad term because every age thinks it's modern. I guess the term postmodern is even more unhelpful from many angles, despite its widespread and confusing deployment in contemporary cultural argument. For the purposes of this course, let's let modernism designate the experimental and avant-garde movements in the arts and literature, especially, that emerged in the late 19th and earlier 20th centuries in Europe and America, from roots in French painting and elsewhere. In Romanticism, in the Romantic movement of the earlier part of the 19th century, the turn of the 19th century, also a crucial root, a crucial source or origin for modernism. Diverse in the extreme, this body of material nevertheless shares certain features, which our course will explore in detail. For us, then, the term is first a period designation, marking out a broad period, roughly the period between, let's say, the 1880s and the 1930s. Modernism as a conscious artistic and literary project appears earlier in Europe than in England or the United States. And that's one reason that our dating must remain vague and encompassing. But no major shift in the practice of the arts is generated from within. The arts are not an autonomous environment, an autonomous energy within culture. They reflect cultural and philosophic and political and economic realities. They as much reflect what is going on around them as they do help to shape those currents, those pressures. And the often radical, deeply experimental painting and literature we call modernism or modernist is no exception to this principle. The modernist writers and painters were part of a much larger cultural and intellectual transformation, whose essential nature is implied in the unsettling skepticism, balked nostalgia, and moral ambiguity that we've already glimpsed in the poem Captain Carpenter. What I'd like to do in this lecture is provide a kind of context within which to understand modern literature, a kind of very skeletal background in which we take account of other forces that lie behind the modernist writers and help to explain the particular character of modernist literature. Now, many of the materials I'm going to talk very briefly about in this talk could themselves be the center of their own subject, of their own course, and in fact, many of them are in university and elsewhere. Their courses in history, in economics, in philosophy, or in cultural history might center on the figures I'm about to talk about and leave the writers that we will focus on in this course more in the background. What I'm offering here, then, is a simplified and skeletal map of what we could call the surround of modern literature, the background to modern literature. We might begin by mentioning a figure whose importance to the history of culture has been a source of disagreement and controversy almost from the beginning: Karl Marx. For Marx, history is a kind of engine that obliterates the old pieties about human agency. Economic forces, class struggles shape consciousness for Marx. The messianic Marx, the Marx who helped create this, whose thought was seized upon by totalitarian communism, may belong to religion and to totalitarian communism. But the man who mapped the birth of capital changed our way of understanding experience. The idea that human beings are, in some sense, in good part, the victims of forces beyond them, forces too large for them to control, of course, is at the very heart of Marxist thought. And we can get some sense of the way in which this kind of attitude was not simply restricted to Marx, but became very much more widespread if we compare reformist writers like Dickens in the earlier part of the 19th century to writers in the later in a later era, like 20th century writers like Shaw or H.G. Wells. The difference between these are all sort of social realists who are concerned with the role of individuals in connection or against the backdrop of the larger social order. And in the case of all of these writers, what we feel is that in Dickens and in other writers like him, there's a much greater emphasis on the notion of individuals changing themselves, transforming their lives by acts of will and by acts of individual reformation. They reform themselves, right? But the later writers are much more conscious of massive social and historical energies that control human life, or that shape it and contain it. And it's those larger forces that the later writers are aware of as requiring change and requiring reform. There's a philosophic background to these attitudes as well. Some of the major philosophers and most influential philosophers of the 19th century wrote philosophic arguments that essentially undermined or put in question the inherited categories and notions of philosophic coherence that had come down to their time. One of the most important of these is the philosopher Schopenhauer, whose philosophy is often described as a kind of modern skepticism. One of his titles is The World as Will and Idea. And the notion that the world itself, the external forces of the world, are a kind of operate as a kind of will, a kind of coercive force that shape individual consciousness, is at the heart of his pessimism, is at the heart of Schopenhauer's view of experience. The philosopher Nietzsche is especially associated with a kind of iconoclastic, pessimistic, aggressively, even intellectually revolutionary attitude toward inherited notions of value and coherence. And these philosophic and historical conceptions of a world of experience that presses upon individuals and controls them in a certain way had a kind of counterpart in developments in the birth of modern science. If we think of the implications, for example, of Darwin's theory of evolution, which emerges centrally in the 19th century, we can see how what the theory of evolution does is displace man from the center of the universe. And, of course, many religious people were very disturbed by Darwinian theory exactly for this reason, and continue to be. And the interesting thing that even into the 20th century, and now into the 21st century, arguments over Darwin's theories center on questions having to do with whether or not there is a prime mover or a god. And so Darwinian theory also displaced man from the center of the universe and laid emphasis on large, long-standing forces, shaping forces. Einstein's work begins to appear in the early part of the 20th century. His famous paper, The Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies, was published in 1905 and later came to be known as the special theory of relativity. And in this theory, both time and motion are understood not to be absolute, but relative to the observer, as if even our most fundamental conceptions of time and of physical motion are put in question, are rendered problematic by the developments of modern science, or by emerging notions of science. And it's as if the physical universe itself had been relativized by such arguments. And that notion of relativism begins to have a counterpart in the world of ethics. Moral relativism becomes a crucial topic for argument and discourse at the end of the 19th and in the early parts of the 20th century. And the English philosopher G.E. Moore wrote a book entitled Ethics, published in 1912, trying to respond to and answer the moral relativists who were saying, look, if what we know about the world, what we're coming to know about the world is true, where do ethical values come from? Again, a deeply destabilizing and a principle that makes inherited moral categories much more problematic than they'd been. The great language philosophers Wittgenstein and Bertrand Russell begin to develop theories of language which make language itself more problematic than it had been before. Wittgenstein, the great philosopher of linguistic complexity and limitation, wrote at one point in his famous Tractatus, 1921, language disguises thought. So much so that from the outward form of the clothing, it is impossible to infer the form of the thought beneath it. An idea that language, far from being an instrument for understanding, might be an instrument for obscuring our understanding of the world. Some of the driven, even compulsive narrators of modern fiction might be said to embody a profound version of this skeptical idea of language and of the difficulties of communication. And Freud's work, Sigmund Freud's work, is part of this process of destabilizing and problematizing the sense of the world that was inherited by and was in some sense shared by the modern novelists we'll be studying. Because Freud's is another skeptical and destabilizing vision. In Freud's conception of the world, we live by forces. We live by forces we don't fully understand or even acknowledge, even know exist, in fact. The idea of the theory of the unconscious, the importance of sexuality, the significance of trivial or minor things in our everyday experience, all these Freudian notions complicate and problematize inherited attitudes about personality and about human selfhood. There's an American contributor to this project who's worth mentioning, complicating our ideas of human nature very deeply. I'm thinking of William James, brother of the great novelist Henry James. William James coined the term stream of consciousness to become such a central category for modern fiction. It's the title of one of the chapters in his book, Principles of Psychology, published in 1892. And he says in that book, within each personal consciousness, states are always changing. Each personal consciousness is sensibly continuous. Well, this idea that the self itself is unstable, that identity is not fixed, but something in motion, something becoming, it's in many ways a disturbing notion. It certainly complicates and destabilizes inherited conceptions of the relation between self and world and the relation between selves and selves. And it is a notion that is picked up and deepened and complicated in many of the modern writers we'll be looking at, most especially in writers like D.H. Lawrence and, as we will see, Virginia Woolf. Well, I've been describing some of the sources of the destabilizing skepticism and self-consciousness that become signature features of modern literature. History, philosophy, notions of ethical value, language, and even personality or the human mind itself are understood to be newly ambiguous, fragmented, disorderly. And let's add one other, even more obvious fact to this: the physical transformation of human life in advanced industrial societies that occurred in the 19th century. The way ordinary people encountered and negotiated with the coming of the machine, the assembly line, the new technologies of transportation and communication. All of these, some of these will define 20th century experience, a new world of speed and steel, a mobile world where people leave their homes and their childhood places for cities, other countries, other continents. People are less connected with their ancestors and with the communal traditions that had sustained them than any human beings before them. So this sort of basic and view of the destabilized circumstances into which our modernist fiction must fit, I think is important and helpful. But it's a mistake to see these developments as entirely bleak, as leading inevitably to the despairing nostalgia that we might associate with the poet T.S. Eliot. Some of the fiction we'll be studying will show this kind of darkness very dramatically. But we can glimpse a less despairing side of the modern, also to be reflected in our novelists, most easily, I think, if we think of the great Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painters whose project may be said to parallel that of modern fiction. So I want to conclude this lecture by turning to that quintessential Impressionist, Claude Monet. He was born in 1840, died in 1926. A figure deeply of the 19th, but also of the 20th century. All his work, the full trajectory of his long career is relevant, of course. But we can come close to his essence, and to the essence of his importance for our understanding of literary modernism, by recalling his famous paintings of series, his famous series paintings. There's a famous series of poplars and haystacks, another of the Paris train depot, another series very lovely series that the English especially treasure, of London and of the Houses of Parliament and of the River Thames, especially in fog. Monet loved fog and what fog did to the physical presences of buildings and trees and so forth. And of course, the great famous series of paintings of water lilies to which Monet devoted the last 20 years of his life. Why would Monet paint the same objects, the same items again and again? What's implied in his preoccupation with the way trees or haystacks or water lilies alter depending on light, on the time of day, on the season, even on the painter's own vantage point or perspective, perhaps even on his emotional state? Well, I think we can seek the answers by focusing on what is, for me, Monet's greatest series, the 30 astounding paintings of Rouen Cathedral that he made at two different times, in February and in April 1892, and then again some months later in 1893. Monet produced 28 images of the main facade of the 14th century Gothic masterpiece, the Cathedral of Rouen. The only two oils, I said he made 30 paintings, and he did. The only two oil paintings not of the main facade show medieval houses that had been attached to one of the cathedral towers. These medieval buildings were destroyed by the Allied bombings of World War II, and it made those two paintings especially precious. Those two paintings, as well as 14 others of the main facade, were brought back to Rouen in 1994 for an exhibition to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the series of paintings. The paintings are officially dated 1894 because after he began them and started them, Monet took them back to his home and finished them at home. My cliff, Monet complained as he worked simultaneously on as many as 14 canvases at the same time, making minute changes as the light altered, aiming to capture the instant before it disappeared. One amazing aspect of the series is how changeable the cathedral seems. Solid and clear in one image, appearing to float and recede in others, suffused in fiery colors in some canvases, and then in fog or cloud in others. Slight shifts in the painter's angle of vision create stunning variations or changes in the play of light and color across the cathedral's sometimes spectral, upthrusting western facade. The constantly changing light and unpredictable weather of Normandy is one of the implicit subjects of the series. They're absolutely amazing paintings. Reproductions don't do justice to the quality of surprise you feel when you look at one painting then at another next to it. And in fact, I've come to realize that it's one of the tragedies of modern life that the paintings have never been shown together. Almost from the first moment that they were exhibited, they were sold off in different ways. And there are two magnificent versions of the paintings in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. There are wonderful versions of the paintings in museums in New York. And of course, there are others of the series are in various museums in Europe. But even that exhibition in Rouen only brought together 16 of the paintings. And it would be an astonishing act of cultural intelligence and respect for the history of art if some museum brought all 30 paintings together. The experience of seeing them all together, I am certain, would be a revelation to many viewers, even to many people who were very familiar with the paintings. Reality, these paintings say, is not one fixed thing. It constantly changes. It is unstable. It resists capture. It must be represented in its multiplicity and its endless nuance. The immense complexity, the uniqueness of each instant, is part of the meaning of these great tentative paintings. So is our own subjectivity a part of the meaning of the paintings. We half create what we see. We half create the things we see, Monet's paintings seem to say. The visible world is still beautiful in this Impressionism, but it is evanescent, transitory. In part, it is even unique to each perceiving eye. There are profound counterparts to this insight in many of the literary texts we'll be studying in this series of lectures. Perhaps the most dramatic and immediate connection between this Monet's idea and the Impressionist and post-Impressionist idea of reality is in Virginia Woolf's novels, and especially in To the Lighthouse, which we'll be talking about down the line later in the course. There is a central character in To the Lighthouse, a woman named Lily Briscoe, a painter, a counterpart to Virginia Woolf herself, who through the whole of the novel is working on a painting. The novel takes place over a long period of time. The first part of the novel takes place in an afternoon. The third part of the novel picks up 10 years later, and Lily picks up her paintbrush and begins to work on and complete the painting that she'd been working on earlier. In her descriptions of Lily's ambition for the painting, Woolf also articulates her own ambitions for her novels. And the descriptions of Lily's ambitions for her paintings are drawn almost, one almost feels that Virginia Woolf was looking at paintings like those by Monet or Cézanne in order to conceive the aesthetic arguments she was making about the evanescence of the moment. So the visible world, as I've suggested, is still beautiful in the Impressionism we see in Monet, but it's evanescent, transitory, unique for each perceiving eye. Monet's career itself can be said to enact something of the larger story of modern art beyond Impressionism. He outlives all his contemporaries and most of the generation of post-Impressionists who are said to build on him and also to reject his psychological realism. Prime instances of this later generation would be Cézanne, Van Gogh, Picasso, and I'll say a few things about these painters in our next lecture. But even in the Rouen Cathedral series, one can see a strong tendency away from simple representation toward a more purely painterly interest in form and color, in the materials of paint for their own sake. The swirl of fog or sunlight against stone comes to own the painting, the paintings sometimes in the Rouen Cathedral series. The cathedral becomes an instrument of verticals and slender jagged-edged cylinders or cones played across by light and shade and color. This awareness in Monet and other Impressionists of the painting as a painting, of its physical existence as canvas and oil paint, constitutes a profound kind of self-consciousness that, again, has crucial counterparts, has crucial echoes in the novelists we'll be talking about. This kind of self-consciousness will come to be understood as a defining feature of the modern. One way in which the modernists saw themselves as profoundly different from their ancestors is connected exactly to this idea that they have a kind of what they would call honesty about the project they're engaged in. What you're looking at is not a photographically realistic representation of the world. You're not supposed to forget the painterly strokes or the frame surrounding the painting when you look. It's not as if the painting is a window on the world and you work through and the medium is a kind of transparent medium through which reality from which reality simply emerges, or in which reality is simply reproduced. It's something much more complicated than that. The medium that is looking at the reality changes the reality, affects the reality, is not the same as the reality. So when we talk about the self-consciousness or the self-reflexiveness of these paintings or of modern fiction, what we're talking about in part is the artist's attempt to remind the viewer, to remind the reader that what you're looking at is words on a page, that what you're looking at is paint, that reality itself is something beyond, that you're looking at a representation of the world, not at the world itself, and that this difference, this mediation between world and representation of the world has to be a part of your understanding of the experience of art. It's a form of honesty, a form of candor, even in a certain way, a confession of limitation. So this awareness in the painters, especially in Monet and the other Impressionists, of the painting as a painting is a crucial element and has powerful counterparts in our modern fiction. The water lily paintings that I mentioned before, painted and posed in Monet's backyard pond, his canvas really for 20 years, clearly dramatize this drive toward the abstract, toward a pure painting, almost a pure painting, but not quite. a pure painting almost devoid of representational elements, but not completely. You can still recognize something of the object represented. But this tendency to move away from realistic representation towards symbolic or abstract forms in which the realistic or representational element becomes only vestigial is, of course, a powerful energy in post-impressionism and in the abstract paintings that grow out of post-impressionism. And we can see this principle also reflected in some of our fiction, in more problematic and disturbing ways in some of our fiction. In James Joyce's Ulysses, for example, as the narrative level of the story kind of recedes as the novel goes on, and as the various voices and perspectives that Joyce introduces to describe the world of his book proliferate, you begin to feel that there's a kind of performance going on in which the medium of language becomes the subject of the book more than the story of Leopold Bloom and his wife. Not quite. You're still interested in Leopold Bloom, and the realistic narrative retains its importance, but it recedes in some sense. It no longer occupies the central place that it did earlier in the novel. And this progress toward a kind of increasing abstraction and self-consciousness about the medium itself is characteristic of modernist art, of modernist literature and modernist art. And this is especially true of Monet's water lilies. In some of the late water lily paintings, the viewer cannot distinguish the flowers from the fluid element in which they swim or float. The border between solid and watery dissolves. The painting becomes an expression of color, form, mass, volume. Almost an abstract meditation on the nature of paint, on the conditions of paint. But at this point, of course, biographical and mortal truths intervene, for we need to remember that these last immense blobbish wonders, they're astonishing paintings. Some of them can be seen today in New York City at the Museum of Modern Art, that these paintings were painted by a half-blind, 86-year-old, frail, doing those lilies once again. He'd been painting them for 20 years, doing those lilies yet again, the brush taped or tied with rags to his stiffened fingers, a great hero of art. The immense complex grandeur of what we take for granted, often that we never even notice, is one meaning of Monet's work, and especially one meaning of the Rouen Cathedral paintings. Describing both the simplicity and the grandeur of Monet's project in the Rouen Cathedral series, one scholar put it memorably. In 1892, Monet focused on the evening light. In 1893, he went after the morning.